Welcome to the second in the series on dynamic leadership, where I'll explore the relationship area of the 7 fitness areas, a critical piece of our ongoing series. The 7 fitness areas is my roadmap to illustrate the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have. It serves as a framework and a guide to building leadership from the inside out. With the first 4 areas, mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, forming the foundation of personal leadership and agency. Now, these are the areas in which we have control, where we choose how we respond, grow, and lead ourselves and others. These first 4 areas, personal leadership and agency, they're a prerequisite for leading others. The last 3 areas, relationship, professional, and financial, represent outcomes. They are where our wants live, the external rewards of the internal work that we do in the first 4 areas. Now, among these, relationships hold a special position. Our ability to build meaningful connections influences every outcome, from team cohesion to professional success and even financial results. Success in the next 2 areas, professional and financial, depend on a level of mastery of the relationship area. Just like success, in the last 3 areas depend on a level of mastery of the first 4. While emotional fitness is in our control, it's also a constant watch area. Emotions can surprise us, triggered by thresholds being crossed, or deep-seated beliefs surfacing unexpectedly, or unconscious rules being violated. This is particularly relevant in relationships where emotions often run high and mismanagement can lead to significant challenges. Simple misunderstandings can consume and dominate the narrative. In last week's session, I introduced the 5 agreements as the foundation for why dynamic leadership is the ideal approach for small businesses. These agreements are not just abstract ideas, but practical insights into how leadership intersects with human behavior. Today, we'll focus on the first agreement. The brain is over 100,000 years old and unlikely to change in our lifetime. At first glance, this might seem trivial, but its implications are profound. While we often focus on learning new frameworks or coming up with a creative way to say old things, what matters most is learning to master what works. The brain's architecture and its evolutionary design tell us that we already have the tools that we need for effective leadership and relationships. The challenge is not invention, but refinement, getting better at leveraging what already works with respect to the brain and the nervous system and our behavior. Understanding this starts with a critical distinction that is often misunderstood, the difference between the conscious and the subconscious. The subconscious is an incredibly powerful driver of behavior, processing information at lightning speed, storing vast amounts of data, and using patterns to guide decisions. Meanwhile, the conscious mind takes a more deliberate role, engaging in creativity, strategy, and abstract thinking. Both play essential roles, but confusing their functions often leads to frustration, inefficiency. The distinction is especially important in the relationship area because relationships thrive or falter based on our ability to align conscious intentions with subconscious drivers. Leadership, after all, is relational at its core. Now, whether you're leading a team, a business, or a family, relationships are where trust is built, where influence happens, and where culture emerges. Now, this is precisely why dynamic leadership is the ideal leadership style for small businesses focused on growing and scaling. Small businesses operate in environments marked by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, often referred to as VUCA, where the need for flexibility, adaptability, and clarity is ever present. Dynamic leadership is designed to meet these demands by balancing structure and agility, leveraging the principles of what already works in human behavior to create sustainable results. This gets to intrinsic motivation, which is one of the core tenets of dynamic leadership. Dynamic leadership integrates the conscious and subconscious elements of leadership. By understanding the subconscious drivers of behavior, leaders can create environments where their teams thrive naturally, building trust, fostering intrinsic motivation, and aligning actions with shared goals. Simultaneously, the conscious elements of dynamic leadership provide a framework for strategy, vision, and operational excellence, ensuring that the organization remains focused and forward thinking. For small businesses, this approach is a game changer. Rather than reinventing the wheel or relying on overly complex strategies, dynamic leadership emphasizes mastery of proven principles. It provides the tools to build resilient cultures, navigate change effectively, and align team dynamics with the organization's mission. Leaders who embrace this style learn how to make the most of their team's potential by aligning their leadership behaviors with what truly works, turning relationships into powerful catalysts for growth. And that's essential when it comes to scaling. Today's focus on the brain, being over 100,000 years old, connects directly to this. By understanding the brain's inherent capabilities and limitations and how they influence relationships and decision making, we gain a clearer path to leading effectively in small business environments. Leadership is not about forcing change, but about facilitating it by aligning with the natural principles of human behavior and creating environments where everyone can excel. Today, I'll unpack what it means to owners and leaders that the brain is over 100,000 years old and why this matters in building effective leadership processes in your organization. I'll start with the difference between the conscious mind and the subconscious. This is a major distinction that people often get wrong, but with a little understanding can begin to see major breakthroughs. I'll begin by looking at what the mind does versus what the brain does. I want to start with the 7 fitness areas roadmap and framework. I mentioned this a little bit in the introduction. So this is the framework that I use to help coaches and leaders self-coach themselves and also have a roadmap in terms of change. I mean, think about it. If we all had a reset button that we could push and design the life that we intend to design, that we intend to live, and with that reset, automatically have the behaviors that are necessary for that outcome, we'd all love to have that reset button and push it. This roadmap is what I came up with to provide that same outcome. Now, you can see the mental, physical, spiritual, those are on the left side, and then the emotional is in the middle. So the left side is clearly what's in our control. The emotional is to a degree in our control, and I talk about emotional modulation. It's not regulation or control, it's modulation, because we don't want to suppress the positive, energizing emotions, but we want to limit what the negative emotions can do, and that gets into emotional modulation. It's out of scope here, but I have it in the middle because it's the one area that, while it's in our control, it's also the one that's easily hijacked. We don't know who's going to come to the table and what they're bringing with them, and simple misunderstandings can turn into major problems. Emotional area, I talk about it here, but it's also going to come up in the relationship, professional, and financial areas because that's where we are involved with other people. We don't really know what deep-seated beliefs and rules that we have that someone can violate, and that violation could be a misunderstanding. It may not even be accurate, and we've all probably experienced that where we misunderstood something or someone. It caused a response by us. That response caused another response, and before you know it, things are off the rails. So emotional is an important area. Again, it's out of scope. I will get into it later on, but I want to get through the first agreement because I want to make the case that dynamic leadership is the best approach or leadership style for small businesses. And by small business, I'm referring to the traditional measure, less than 400 people. There's no magic or science there. It's more art. But what happens is under 400 people, roughly, again, I mean, it changes because you have outsourcing and different ways of structuring your operating model to meet your business model. But generally speaking, once you cross 400, you get an exponential increase in revenue per employee. What does that mean? When you have a tight or a smaller revenue per employee, you have less room for error. You have less margin. You can't be as flexible. Whereas you have a large organization that has 2 or 3x the revenue per employee, it doesn't hurt them to have a few employees sitting around doing nothing because it's covered. And I don't mean that in a negative way. My point is sometimes You just have to wait. Sometimes the right decision is to wait, but when you've got a low revenue per employee, waiting is very, very expensive. Whereas the larger organizations have an advantage because they can wait until that right time to act, and they can take more time to build their next strategy, which is a huge part, and it's why the fifth agreement has to do with project excellence and operational excellence. So the other thing that happens above 400, it has to do with investors and, I'll say, controlling boards come into play because there's more at risk. You have more stakeholders, and those stakeholders bring on the board, which is not a bad thing. I think small businesses should start getting boards earlier rather than later. In that regard, it's more about helping them reach their goals rather than the traditional thought about boards, which is governance. So we need to step into that, leveraging the mentoring of others who've done it before, long before we need a board for governance. But that board, once the board is in there, it could impact the leadership styles. Why? Because different people on that board come from different disciplines. Dynamic leadership sits on a continuum between command and control and servant leadership. Now, both of those have their strengths, but what we need is a blend most of the time, and we need to know when to use what. And what happens is not only is it command and control and servant leadership, there are other factors as well. There's the metaphor. Is the leader's metaphor one of we're all a family? Is it military, which brings in the command and control? Is it more of a political thing, which means there's two camps? Is it maybe more of a friend kind of thing, which means we're going to have vending machines, with free food and drinks? Whatever that person brings to the table could influence what the CEO is doing in terms of their leadership style. So that's why I break the cutoff at 400. But again, it's not science. It's not cast in stone. And I think that large companies should be looking into dynamic leadership. It's just that from a consulting standpoint, it's a little bit more difficult to make that happen because there's other stakeholders. The first thing I want to deal with is this relationship area. That's why I brought this slide up, because in the relationship area, this is the first one. Everything on that right side involves other people. Professional, financial, those goals have to do with how well you can influence other people. And as I was saying earlier, how well we modulate our emotional area has a major impact on the quality of our relationships. We all have heard, and we've probably been there, where we've seen business relationships endure where the price may not be the best, the offer may not be the best, but they stay for the relationship. And we've seen others where there could be the best price, the best offer, the best package, but the relationship breaks down and we lose the client. Relationships is the first one on that right side, and it's where I'm starting. And back to the point, the brain is 100,000 years old, and there are major, often under the radar factors with respect to the brain. So I want to start with the difference between the mind and the subconscious. This area for me is one of the major ones. I think there's a lot that hinges on this, and it's also one of the ones that's most difficult for people to understand. When I'm interacting with people around this topic, this is the one that's hard for them to get their head wrapped around, and it's the one that most often sneaks back in and impacts their results. If you can lock this in, you will see the world differently. And I don't know if we'll get there today, if everybody can get there today, but I'll bring this up and I will continue to bring it up. And in fact, I'll leave this segment on the LinkedIn Live because this is such an important point. You have the mind, and we're going to just put that over here, mind. And it's over here with things like spirit and soul. The reason I put them together is because they're undefinable. People will come up with answers of what the mind is. The one that I hear most often is the mind is the brain at work, which I 100% disagree with, but it's undefinable. The one that I do like is that the mind regulates energy. And the reason that's important is because when you think about it from a quantum standpoint, everything that's going on in our body comes down to energy. Thought at its most basic form is energy. And a lot of the law of attraction people talk about vibration and energy. And my choice is to explain that not from a law of attraction standpoint. Law of attraction was created in the late 1800s. It's been popularized more recently. But the objective for me is to remove the woo-woo gap. And what I mean by the woo woo gap is as long as we can blame it on something that's out there or require something that's outside of us in order for us to get what we want, we have an out. And that limits our agency. So we can't have agency unless we are 100% certain that we're in control of the necessary inputs. Now, that's not to say there's not a spiritual realm. I think there's a huge spiritual realm, but it's out of scope for me because what we have to do in the business world is know that our inputs are going to equal certain outputs and that we know where to look when it breaks down. Now, the part that does come into place on the 7 fitness areas, the spiritual area has to do with our higher self. And in this context, you have the higher self, and then you have the conscious mind, and then you have the subconscious. And by definition, like the higher self is above, the conscious mind is the mind, and then the sub is below the mind. The subconscious is below the mind. Too often people let the subconscious become equal with the mind, or in some cases, they let the subconscious become above by thinking that the subconscious is the higher self. And that's a huge mistake, and this is where we get into problems. And then over here, we have the brain. I'm not going to explain the entire brain. I will talk about the reticular activating system, and I will talk about the prefrontal cortex. And everything I talk about here, you can look up. You can Google it, quick Google search. You can go to ChatGPT. Everything I talk about is consistent with what best practices, with what's known in terms of, in with respect to neuroscience. There's nothing new here. I'm looking at it in a different way, and this is important. So I'm going to start right here. The distinction between the mind and the brain, in the very short version of this, is that the mind is the mind, and as I already said, I like the definition that it regulates energy. The brain is essentially the subconscious. Now that's the part that has difficulty for people because they call the subconscious a mind. Now this has been going on for centuries, and that's part of the problem. All the textbooks, all the university courses, they all talk about it as the mind. For people who are over 50, we learned that it was a mind. And any book you pick up, generally speaking, is. However, if you look at what the brain is, we have 86 billion neurons, and then throughout the body there's another 14 billion, and this is where we get 100 billion neurons. And of that 86 billion in the brain, 20 billion are in the prefrontal cortex. The reason that's important is the prefrontal cortex completes its formation between ages 19 and 27. And the 20 billion neurons were always there, but they were not dormant, but they were underdeveloped. Meanwhile, you have 0 to 7, where the bulk of those neurons they have a very low threshold for myelination, and myelination is magnified. What I mean by that is for an adult, to get myelin to wrap a neural pathway, it takes deep practice. So deep practice becomes that bar. You cross that bar of deep practice. That's what coaches do with athletes. They're conditioning them. If you look at drills are deep practice because you're doing it over and over, and it's a short part of it looking for perfection. And it's the idea of perfection that meets the standard for deep practice, which is struggling on the edge of ability. That getting perfection on a very small segment. Imagine a piano player playing an entire piece over and over trying to fix one part of it versus a piano player who takes the one part that they're having trouble with and they go into deep practice doing drills on it. They speed it up, they slow it down, they stop it, they start it, right? They do different things, they press themselves differently. That's struggling on the edge of ability. I read somewhere that Steph Curry, when he practices the long shots, he's practicing looking at the hooks on the rim that hold the net, and he's aiming with respect to where those hooks are. That's deep practice. He knows he can make the basket, but to make the basket in a certain relationship to one of the hooks, predetermined, that's deep practice. And what's missed is that if I told you that deep practice builds muscle memory, I would say 99% of the people I mentioned that to would agree. What they don't connect is that it's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. What we're doing, deep practice wraps neural pathways with myelin, and that myelin is what makes the neural pathway fire faster, stronger, and with more precision. So the same way nervous system memory works, With athletics and muscle memory, it works with thinking and thought and feelings because it can trigger emotions. What I want to focus on is that from 0 to 7, it's a low threshold and it's a magnification, meaning that it doesn't take much for myelin to wrap as though there was deep practice. This is why they say from 0 to 7, the majority of our conditioning is done. Kids walk around from 0 to 2 in theta state, and then from 3 to 7, roughly, in alpha state. So it's just a download. It makes sense if you think about it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint, because the child is learning from 0 to 7 how to get along in the tribe, what to do with hunting and gathering, because by 8, they will probably be out there hunting and gathering. It even worked in our agricultural environment, which wasn't that long ago. But today, with the amount of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, it doesn't work. The world that existed when I was 0 to 7 is so different than the world that existed today. There were no fax machines, there were no cell phones, there was no email, there weren't even cordless phones. That's why I talked about the reset button. We have to be able to reset our conditioning. That's why it's important that we accept that the brain is 100,000 years old and we stop looking for new ways to figure it out, and we start drilling deep on what works. And I encourage you to work it out for yourself. You could research any of these points I'm bringing up and reading it, review it, and then formulate your own point of view around it so it's in your words. This is not going to change. This 0 to 7, the 20 billion neurons, the 86 billion neurons, what you will find is that there's this other thing called mirror neurons. And the mirror neurons is how we have empathy with other people. Mirror neurons were first discovered around in the 1980s. The documentation began, scientific documentation began around the early 90s in the context of a 100,000-year-old brain. And parts of the brain are a million years old. I get that, but I talk about it as over 100,000 because it encompasses the million-year-old parts. Knowing about mirror neurons for the last 40 years is still in its infancy. There's still so much learning about it, but it's essentially where we have empathy. It's why when a person yawns, we might yawn. It's why the parts of the brain light up. If I watch somebody raise their hand and do a certain motion, the same parts of my brain light up that lit up in their brain. So in other words, their brain lights up to do this motion. My brain, the areas of the brain, they light up too by seeing the motion. This is why they have this research and studies. They do a lot with athletics because athletics is easy to measure. But when you step back and remember that it's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory, it reminds us of what I'm talking about here. Took these groups of athletes in military school, they would introduce different people into the group. The overall fitness of the group, if you take the average overall fitness of the group and you introduced someone who was less fit than the group, it actually dragged the average fitness of the entire group down beyond what the number would. Obviously, if you introduce a lower number into an average, it's going to bring it down. But no, it lowered everyone's fitness just by introducing a less fit person. It did not have the same effect on the opposite end. So when you introduce a new person who has higher fitness, it doesn't necessarily drag them up. I don't have the scientific explanation for that, but I would just look at it as entropy. We all know that you can't just put your lawn in place and leave it. There's going to be weeds, and so it's easier, obviously, for things to drop down with neglect. They're not going to just improve with neglect. But the bigger point is when you think about culture in your organization, that's in play, right? Because as you introduce people into your organization, as you introduce concepts into your organization, you are impacting the culture. This is a very, very important point, and it gets to leadership. I've seen leaders, I've heard them say that you can't impact culture. The thing, culture eats strategy for lunch, and then so they spend, millions of dollars on consulting, but then there's people in the organization who believes that culture eats strategy for lunch and you can't change culture. I agree that culture is very difficult to change. I don't agree that you can't define what the culture is going to be and do that with intention. And I also disagree that you can't change it. It's just hard to change. But I'm talking to small business owners, and it would be a mistake for a small business owner to start their journey thinking that they can't impact the culture. That would be a mistake, because you can. Not only can you impact it, you can define what it is intentionally. And just by who you select and deselect, you're constantly reinforcing what you believe the culture should be. As you can see on this slide, there's quite a bit of differences between the mind and the brain. Once you start seeing the world through this lens, it makes it easier for you to see it. The mind is so much slower than the brain, and this is one of the ways that you can tell the difference is with fast and slow thinking. If it's fast thinking, it's probably coming from the brain and the subconscious. If it's slower thinking, it's probably coming from the mind, and that's because the brain and subconscious is not really thinking. It's just impulses going through the neural pathways, and with myelin, it gets faster and faster. The reason I'm providing this is, again, so you can start seeing the difference between the two. A few points. The mind, it creates and innovates. It can design in the field of infinite possibilities and imagine new solutions, whereas the brain processes information rapidly. It executes tasks thousands of times faster than the mind. The brain can literally, with all those neurons, process at 11 million bits per second, whereas the mind processes at only 50 bits per second. When I talk about the brain being different from the mind, the brain is physical, right? We all agree that if a person dies, the mind, spirit, and soul, that's gone. The brain, nervous system, the neural pathways are there. What goes through the neural pathways may be gone. That's why, again, the mind regulating energy is a good way that I like to look at it. But the impulses going through the neural pathways, that's energy. And guess what? Thought in its most basic form is also energy. So it makes sense that people would think that the subconscious is a mind because it feels like thought. But once you can tell the difference, there's ways to discern when a impulse is coming from the subconscious versus when a thought is coming from the mind. And there's different things you can do with questions. And part of this work is about figuring out how to discern when it's coming from the mind, which is a thought, versus when it's coming from the subconscious, which is an impulse. Now that's important because the mind can relate the normally unrelated, right? I said the mind can create in the field of possibilities. It can draw connections between seemingly unrelated ideas, whereas the brain and the subconscious, it's all about associations. It's the past. If you look at habits were formed in the past. When you consider that the brain processes 11 million bits of information per second, that's associations. They're already there. Now, I say largely from the past because I can get into deep practice for the future. I can visualize the future and use deep practice, and I can create new associations for the future. And when I do that, then obviously those are new associations. And this is in part how we start resetting the habits. We apply deep practice with visualization, and we also move the subconscious below the conscious mind. We have to rethink the stimulus response cycle. So most people have heard of the stimulus response cycle. There's a cause and effect. The stimulus happens, and then there's a response. You remember Pavlov's dogs. He would ring a bell, give food, salivate, ring a bell, give food, salivate. And then he would ring the bell without the food, and they would salivate. Very, very basic example, but it applies over and over and over. The other thing that's really interesting is that we make 33,000 choices a day. Again, research this. You don't have to take my word for it. But one of the agreements is that we spend more than half our waking hours at work. And when you start adding in commute time and the fact that you're eating lunch somewhere relative to work, you get very close to 2/3 of the waking day. And for a lot of people, it's more than that because of the long commute that's all applied to work. When you have that much time involved with work, we're not only dealing with our own habits, but we're dealing with the habits that are existing in the organization. And these habits, the stimulus response cycle, is basically what a habit is. Now, the way I would look at it is like this. First, there's pre-stimulus. Then we have the stimulus response cycle, and then we have the outcome. And this stimulus response cycle is what I would say happens. These are the choices that we're making. When they say we make 33,000 choices, and it might say 33,000 decisions a day, and by the way, there's about 65,000 seconds that we're awake in a day. So if we're awake 65,000 seconds and we're making 33,000 choices, you can see every 2 seconds, we're making a new choice. This gets to the powerful present moment. So how many powerful present moments do we have? Thousands and thousands. I think, you can have more than one moment inside of a second. But even if you just start with the second, 65,000 moments, those are opportunities where we can influence the outcome by having a different stimulus response cycle. The stimulus response cycle is very, very fast. This happens in oftentimes less than a second. You have an impulse, right? And it happens right away. Think about Pavlov's dogs. The bell rings, they salivate. The pre-stimulus is also an area for opportunity. Too often people spend their energy and time on the outcome by trying to force the outcome. And I'll talk in later episodes about that impact, because if you spend too much time focusing on the outcome, you're focusing too much on compliance. You start using extrinsic motivation, you start using rules, you start using the carrot and the stick. And what happens is it's like whack-a-mole. Humans are going to meet their needs with you or without you. If you're focusing on compliance, you're going to start getting defiance. When you focus too much on extrinsic rewards, you get unintended consequences. Anyone who's worked on incentive compensation knows that you have to allow for unintended consequences. And if you try to work the unintended consequences out of the system with complexity, then you lose the benefit of the incentive. So you learn to just accept that there's going to be unintended consequences, and you just keep tweaking it. The incentive structure is just the way it is. But it's better than nothing at all. But better than that is to have intrinsic motivation. So I would say both. I'm not against extrinsic motivation, especially in sales and those related areas, business development. But I would definitely be leaning more into intrinsic motivation, because there's no cap. With extrinsic motivation, people often leave money on the table. So to get some of that money off the table from the extrinsic motivation, you can introduce resourcefulness in intrinsic motivation. We'll get into that later on. The pre-stimulus, this area has, there's a lot that's in here. It's beliefs, we have habits, and again, that myelin, the habits are formed from 0 to 7. A lot of the habits are from the past. They're not necessarily for where we're going. And if you think about going after your vision or life design, we run into the problem of using old solutions for new problems that are emerging. With beliefs, you can see that limiting beliefs come in. You can have, there are things that you choose not to do just because of belief. Then we have priming. And while these do have a conscious component, they're largely more impacting the subconscious component. I would say on a day-to-day basis, our pre-stimulus area is probably more habit than not. We can change it, but you have to also change this to change the pre-stimulus area. So they go hand in hand. Then you also have mindset. And we know that growth mindset has a lot to do with our results. So being able to maintain a growth mindset, and more importantly, get back to a growth mindset when you're triggered into a fixed mindset. When I say quickly, I'm talking about milliseconds. We want to catch it in less than a second that you're flipping into a fixed mindset and correct it very quickly. That should become a habit. And this is why the stimulus response cycle becomes important, because in stimulus response, it's not just stimulus response, it's stimulus. I would say there's cognitive biases that go into play. Then there's reaction. Then there's response. Then there's decision. And then there's action. So there's a whole lot happening in that 1 second. Stimulus goes through the cognitive biases. We have the reaction. We have the response. And in here is where we get the emotion. Somewhere in here where emotions can come into play, we get triggered. Then the decision is made, and then you have an action. And this is what's happening 33,000 times a day. So if you look at it another way, let's say we wake up at 6 a.m., we go to sleep at 9 p.m. We have a pre-stimulus. Basically, our day is structured as pre-stimulus. You think about it, you probably brush your teeth the same exact way. You probably put the sock on or the shoe on the first one every single day. You probably leave for work or whatever it is. Your ritual to leave is probably the same every single day. When you get to work, your ritual is probably the same every single day. So this whole pre-stimulus area is a great big stimulus response. This thing can group. They can group together when they're fire often. They get grouped together. It's called a meta program, but essentially it's a combination of stimulus responses that they just fire together because you use them together all the time. It's like I said, kicking off, flossing, brushing your teeth, or what have you, interacting, how you cook. All these things can go into, you can see them from a stimulus response lens. The other thing that's added on here in the pre-stimulus is physiology. And that physiology, think about low energy, high energy, positive energy, negative energy. That gets back to how we're feeling. Something as simple as posture. If you come in and you're in a depressed posture, that posture can create fight or flight. It can create a stress response. Just how you're holding your body, just how you're breathing, shallow breathing can create a stress response. It can create anxiety. See, the neurons, the neural pathways fire both ways. So when I hold a particular posture, that fires those kinds of neurons that are associated with that. That's why they say you can't have negative thoughts while you're smiling, because you're firing those other neurons. Similarly, when you have shallow breathing, or when you're holding your head down and looking defeated, that creates a stress response. It's the same thing. It gets back to this. People understand it when they talk about muscle memory, but they don't think about muscle memory being nervous system memory. So the same way nervous system memory works with athletics and muscle memory, it works with thinking and thought and feelings, because it can trigger emotions. Now, again, part of this has to be learning how to modulate your emotions so that they don't have that impact. And then we have 33,000 choices every single day. The pre-stimulus, along with the physiology, we have this grouping of stimulus responses, and then we have our outcomes. So if you're a leader or an owner and you want specific outcomes, you have to consider what's going on here and what's going on here to make major strides over here. As I said, too many times we focus on outcomes and we get into things like compliance and extrinsic motivations and the carrot and the stick and penalties and the like. This is where command and control falls down, because it's like whack-a-mole. Command and control works in the military or in combat units because there's a lot of levers, there's a lot of controls that the leader can put in place, all the way up to court martial. And it starts with just the threat of taking away freedoms or taking away money. When you do relieve someone, you're relieving them of their command or their position, but they're still in the Army getting, or the Air Force or whatever branch, still getting a paycheck. Whereas when you fire somebody from a job in a business, you're taking away their income. And so it's a much larger hurdle. But there's a lot of reasons I can explain why command and control works in a military environment and where it falls down in a business environment. Same thing with servant leadership. Servant leadership, we start feeding into this pre-stimulus side, and we allow some pre-stimulus that are not useful or relevant for what we want to do, and they start to come into play. Some examples that leaders often run into, especially when you start moving somebody into the next leadership position. So oftentimes you're promoting somebody and they have to develop while they're in that position, but then you find out that maybe they get triggered by certain things, or you may find out that they get really nervous in certain settings. And if you think about those outcomes, so how do you tell a person to stop getting triggered? How does that work? When you go back to understanding the pre-stimulus and what's causing it, and building a new habit using deep practice. Another example might be telling tension. Oftentimes, if you're in a meeting, the leaders have to learn to hold their tongue, to not speak until everybody's had a chance to speak. Sometimes people get telling tension, and you can spot it. Most of these things you can spot when it's one down. You may not spot it for yourself, but when it's one down from you, you can spot it, just like the people who are one up from you can spot it in you. But telling tension can be a challenge because things have to unfold. If you think about change management, you want to let people struggle with the information and come to their conclusions before they're ready for the next one. Otherwise, you're forcing compliance, which can lead to defiance. A very good example is ums and uhs. People, you can almost predict with some speakers when the next is going to come. It may not seem like a big deal, but as a leader, you are enrolling and inspiring people into a vision. And when you start using ums and uhs and it breaks up your speaking, that impacts your ability to inspire them. Like storytelling is all about emotion, driving emotion. Well, if you're saying and all the time and it's predictable, it becomes a super distractor. So how do you get a person to stop saying and You tell them, it doesn't work. We can actually fix that. And it's very easy to fix it in the stimulus reaction stage, because the is actually like Pavlov's dogs with the bell. It's actually a response to a particular stimulus. And if you look at where some of those ums come, and when they come, you can see what the stimulus is and start working there. Once you retrain that, they'll no longer say and unless they choose to. But then when it gets to conscious choice, you're out of the habit realm. And if they choose to keep saying and that's a different conversation. But the first thing you have to do is make them aware of it. And the second thing you have to do is give them a choice to do something different, which is a pause. And once you've installed those two things, the awareness and then the alternate response or reaction, which is the pause, the uhs and ums will go away. Again, an example as to where people focus on outcomes. Look at how many speakers, professional speakers are out there, politicians, etc., and they're still saying ums and uhs. They've been in the position for years. It literally can fix it in 20 minutes, and you'll start to see improvement right away. Another one was lashing out. Sometimes people, there's a misunderstanding, and kind of goes with triggering, and people lash out. If their pet project is attacked, they lash out. There's some people you just don't have in the room at the time you're working on something. There's some people who, there should be people at the table, and there's other people who should not be at the table just because of that. But how do you tell them to stop lashing out? It doesn't work. But when you work on it from the pre-stimulus, you work in that area, the beliefs, habits, the priming, the mindset. Physiology might feel a little awkward to talk about that in the business environment, but this is where you have to start. And this is why coaching comes into play. But then you can move the stimulus and response. Remember, this is an all-day thing over here, pre-stimulus. The stimulus response is happening 33,000 times a day, and it's constant. So this is where the work happens. You can't stop the stimulus coming in, but what you can do is change your reaction and your response. And a lot of it comes down to putting in a pause. But because this is all happening in less than a second, you got 750 milliseconds that are going on here. We're talking about pauses of a quarter of a second can have a dramatic impact on results. On the other side of lashing out, we might have shrinking from adversity. Sometimes you have leaders who don't step up. They abdicate their responsibility to lead. There's some reason, there's something that causes that to happen. And we need to get into that. Nice to get into it before they're promoted into the position. But some of these things you're not going to find out until they're facing it. So you have to have a way of getting there. And this is why dynamic leadership is important, because you have to be able to see it through the lens of the mind versus the subconscious, which is also the brain. And once you can see it that way, you can start to see pathways that are other than just telling the people over and over and over. And then another big one is fear. So many of our things that we don't want to do come down to fear. While saying that, there's also this thing called I don't want power. And I talked about the prefrontal cortex and the 20 billion neurons. In the prefrontal cortex is self-control mechanisms, and the self-control mechanisms can create the I don't want. So a person may have a rule that says that they're not going to do X, Y, and Z. You're asking them to do something, and that something you're asking them to do has elements of X, Y, and Z, and they just have internal conflict. They can't get there. And that's the I don't want power. An example I've used in the past is somebody may have had an experience, maybe their parent had a bad experience with the salesperson, and they rant and rave about how they don't like salespeople. The kid is 0 to 7 years old. It gets locked in, myelinated neurons, it fires. They're 30 years old. They're thinking about selling, or you're asking them to make sales calls. And this rises up as an I don't want because they remember the experience. They don't remember, but the association from 5 years old, and that becomes an I don't want. That's the self-control mechanism. Self-control is a good thing in the prefrontal cortex, but it can come in as an I don't want. And we have to be able to listen for that and understand when you're dealing with an I don't want power. And the solution is not just telling them. And that's the big part of this page here. It's, you have to know when to use. There's times where you just need to listen and let people work things out, and then have some grace, because you're not just telling them to put the widget here instead of over here. You're actually dealing with beliefs and habits and priming and mindset, and then their whole stimulus response cycle, which is very quick. You want to see things differently. This is why agency and personal leadership is so important when it comes to dynamic leadership, because we have to be able to manage ourselves. We have to be able to control our own impulses before we can pay attention and listen to and understand what's going on with our people. It's very difficult to see the things I'm talking about here with respect to the what's coming from the pre-stimulus and the stimulus response, it's very difficult to see that when we're caught up in our own lashing out or being triggered or protecting our pet projects. We have to be able to manage our own internal processing that's going on before you can see what's going on with your people. And you have to be able to see it before you can make choices about the best way to resolve it. So I'm going to leave it there. So we'll talk next week, and feel free to drop in some questions if you have them. And eventually I'll start introducing some Q&A time so that we can spend time talking about this stuff real time. All right, see you next time.